Before you spend another dollar buying flowers next spring, take a look at the perennials already growing in your garden. Some of those big, crowded clumps can be turned into several new plants this fall, and if you divide them at the right time, you could be setting yourself up for a much fuller flower display next year. And if you enjoy practical gardening tips like this, take a second to like this video, subscribe to My Garden Blooms, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss the next one. But there's a catch. Not every perennial should be divided the same way, and dividing the wrong plant or doing it at the wrong time can set it back instead of multiplying it. So today, I'm showing you 7 perennials that are worth looking at this fall, exactly what to look for before you divide them, and the mistakes you absolutely want to avoid. And make sure you stay with me for number 7, because it's one of those perennials that can quietly become overcrowded, and dividing it can give you several new plants from something you already have. Most people think of fall as a cleanup season. You're cutting things back, raking leaves, putting the garden to bed for winter. But fall is also something else. It's the multiplication season. The soil is still warm from summer, which helps roots settle in before the ground freezes. The air is cooler, so the plant isn't losing water as fast through its leaves. And the plant itself has already finished the hard work of blooming, so it can put its energy into rebuilding roots instead of flowers. That combination, warm soil, cool air, and a plant that's done blooming for the year, is exactly why fall works so well for dividing a lot of perennials. So instead of thinking about what you need to buy next spring, let's look at what's already sitting in your garden, waiting to become 2, 3, or even 4 plants. 1. Daylilies. If you've grown daylilies for more than a couple of years, you've probably noticed the clump getting bigger every season. At first, that's a good thing, more foliage, more blooms. But eventually, the center of the clump gets so crowded that the roots start competing with each other for water and nutrients, and you'll actually see fewer flowers instead of more. That crowding is your cue. A daylily clump that's been in the ground 3 years or more, especially one that started blooming less than it used to, is a strong candidate for division, and daylilies are about as forgiving as perennials get. What to look for? You're looking for a clump with a dense center, foliage that's noticeably thicker at the base than it was a couple of years ago, and this is the tell: a bloom count that's dropped off even though the plant looks healthy otherwise. What to do? Dig a wide circle a few inches out from the base so you don't slice through the roots. Then lift the whole clump out of the ground. Once it's out, you'll see it's really a cluster of individual fans, each with its own roots attached. You can gently pull healthy fans apart by hand, or use a garden fork inserted into the center and pried apart if the clump is stubborn. Each division just needs a fan of leaves and a healthy root system attached. That's a complete new plant. Replant the divisions at the same depth they were growing before, water them in well, and by next summer, each one should be developing into its own full clump with the bloom count you were missing this year. 2. Hostas. Hostas are slow to show it, but a mature clump eventually turns into a solid mound with almost no visible growing points in the middle. The leaves on the outer edge look fine, but the plant as a whole stops expanding the way it used to. A hosta that's been established for 4 or 5 years, especially one that's stopped putting out new growth at the same rate, is ready to be split, and because hostas root back in quickly, fall division barely sets them back at all. What to look for? Check the base of the plant. If you can see multiple distinct crowns, separate clusters of shoots, rather than one solid mass, that's your sign it's ready. What to do? Lift the whole root ball out with a spade, keeping as much soil around the roots as you can. Then look for the natural separations between crowns. A clean knife or a spade, driven straight down through the root ball, will separate healthy sections, each one with its own shoots and root mass. Get those divisions back in the ground quickly so the roots don't dry out, water them thoroughly, and they'll spend the next few weeks re-establishing before winter, which means they're ready to take off again as soon as the ground warms up in spring. 3. Peonies. Now, this next one is a little different, and I want to slow down here, because peonies aren't a plant you divide casually. Peonies can live for decades without ever needing to be divided. So the first thing to understand is that most peonies don't need this at all. You're only considering division if the plant has stopped flowering well, despite otherwise looking healthy, or if you specifically want to create new plants from an established one. If you do decide to divide, fall is the right window, but peonies are unforgiving about depth and timing, in a way daylilies and hostas simply aren't. What to look for? You're looking for the eyes, the small reddish buds near the base of the plant where next year's growth will emerge. What to do? Dig around the entire root system carefully, since peony roots are thick and can be damaged easily. Once it's lifted, each division needs at least 3 to 5 eyes attached to a healthy piece of root, fewer than that, and the new plant may take years to bloom well again. Here's the part that trips people up. When you replant, the eyes should sit no more than about 2 inches below the soil surface. Plant them too deep, and the peony may grow beautiful foliage for years without ever flowering. Done correctly, a peony division can take 2 to 3 years to really hit its stride. This isn't a fast multiplication project like daylilies. But if your peony genuinely needs it, or you want to start new plants from an established one, doing it right the first time saves you years of disappointment. 4. Bearded iris. Bearded iris grow from rhizomes, thick, fleshy stems that sit right at or just below the soil surface. Over a few years, those rhizomes multiply and start crowding each other out, and the center of the clump often turns woody and stops producing flowers altogether, even while the outer edges look fine. This is one of the more visually obvious signs in the whole list. If you see a ring of blooms around the outside of a clump with a bare, unproductive center, that's a bearded iris telling you it needs to be divided. What to look for? Look for rhizomes that are congested and overlapping, and check for a woody, hollow-feeling center with little to no foliage coming from it. What to do? Lift the whole clump with a garden fork, then separate the rhizomes by hand or with a clean knife. Each healthy division should include 1 firm rhizome with a fan of leaves attached, and no soft or rotten spots. Discard anything that's mushy, discolored, or hollow. This is also the point where many gardeners accidentally make a mistake, and it's worth pausing on. Bearded iris rhizomes should be planted with the top surface exposed, or just barely covered, not buried like a bulb. Plant them too deep, and the rhizome can rot, or the plant simply won't flower. Set the rhizome on top of a small mound of soil in the planting hole. Spread the roots down the sides, and cover just the roots, leaving the rhizome itself at or just above the surface. Space the divisions out with room to spread, and by next season, you should see individual fans of foliage where you once had one overcrowded clump, each capable of blooming on its own. 5. Black-eyed Susans. Black-eyed Susans spread readily, which is part of their appeal, but that same habit means an established clump can turn into a dense, tangled mat of roots and stems within a few years, crowding out the plants around it and blooming less at the center. If your clump has expanded well beyond where you originally planted it, or you're noticing fewer blooms toward the middle, fall division both controls the spread and gives you new plants for other parts of the garden. What to look for? A dense root mass at the base, foliage that's thinned out in the center compared to the edges, and a clump that's simply outgrown its space. What to do? Dig up the root mass and use a spade or your hands to pull apart sections, each with some stems and a healthy portion of roots attached. Black-eyed Susans are tough, so don't worry about being too gentle here. Replant the sections with room to spread, water them in, and next season you'll have multiple smaller clumps instead of one overgrown one filling in bare spots elsewhere in the garden for free. 6. Coneflowers. Coneflowers, like black-eyed Susans, tend to expand outward over time, and a mature clump can become woody and less productive in the center after several years in the same spot. Fall division isn't just about controlling size here. It's a chance to reset an aging clump and get more consistent blooms across the whole plant instead of just around the edges. What to look for? A center that looks sparse or woody compared to vigorous new growth at the outer edge is your clearest signal. What to do? Dig up the clump and divide it into sections, making sure each piece has healthy roots and at least a few visible growth points. Discard the old woody center if it's no longer producing new shoots. This is really the heart of what this whole video is about. You're not buying new coneflowers next spring. You're just resetting the ones you already have into several younger, more productive plants. Get the divisions in the ground early enough that they have a few weeks to establish roots before a hard freeze. 7. Garden phlox. This last one is the one I mentioned at the start, and I saved it for a reason. It's one of the perennials people forget can even be divided at all. Garden phlox forms a dense root system that gradually thickens over the years. Most gardeners just deadhead it and move on, not realizing that an old clump is quietly getting overcrowded underground, which is often why established phlox starts blooming less or getting powdery mildew more easily. Overcrowded growth means poor air circulation. If your phlox has been in the same spot for several years and seems to be struggling more than it used to, smaller blooms, more mildew, thinner flowering, division can genuinely revive it. What to look for? A thick, congested root clump at the base, and stems that seem more crowded together than they were a few seasons ago. What to do? Dig up the clump and separate it into sections by hand or with a spade, making sure each division has a healthy piece of root system and several stems attached. Replant the divisions with a bit more spacing than the original clump had. That improved airflow alone can mean fewer mildew problems next season, on top of the extra plants you now have to work with. Now, before you go out and start dividing every perennial in your garden, there's something important you need to know. Not everything on this list or in your garden should be divided just because it's fall. A few things to actually check first. Plant maturity. A perennial needs a few years of established growth before division makes sense. Dividing something too young can set it back significantly. Current health. If a plant is already stressed, diseased, or struggling, division adds more stress it may not recover from. Wait until it's healthy again. Your local climate, colder zones should divide earlier in fall, so roots have time to establish before the ground freezes. Milder climates allow more flexibility. Timing for the specific plant. Not every perennial wants to be divided at exactly the same point in fall. Check the specific needs of whatever you're dividing. Establishment time. As a general rule, divisions need several weeks of root growth before a hard freeze. If dividing very late in the season, it may be safer to wait until spring. A few mistakes worth avoiding, no matter which plant you're working with. Don't divide simply because it's fall on the calendar. Divide because the plant is actually showing signs it's ready. Don't make your divisions too small. A tiny scrap of root with no real growth point often won't survive. Don't keep weak, damaged, or rotten sections just to get more plants out of the clump. A few strong divisions beat several weak ones. And don't skip the water. Newly divided perennials need consistent moisture to rebuild their root systems before winter, even though the weather is cooler. So before you decide that your garden needs more plants next spring, take another look at the perennials you already have. That crowded clump you've been meaning to deal with may actually be your opportunity to create several new plants. Just remember, division isn't about digging up everything in sight. It's about knowing which plants are ready, dividing them at the right time, and giving those new sections the care they need to establish. Do it right this fall, and next year you may find your garden fuller than ever, without spending a dime on new plants.